I want to welcome everybody to this next event in the series of Community of Practice webinars. The purpose of these webinars is to offer practitioners of concepts and methods related to risk-informed and performance-based approaches, RIPB we call them, a chance to share their knowledge and experience. I expect that such practices used for implementing nuclear technology and evaluating its safety among a wide range of practitioners. The Risk-Informed Performance-Based Principles and Policy Committee, of which I am the current chair of ANS, has been putting on these events for the past 3.5 years or so. The presentations and recordings of the events are available to the public at the ANS website under the tab RP3C. There are now more than 40 such recordings available. The purpose of RP3C is to help modernize ANS standards. The Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, NEMA, call it, of 2019, associates modernization with application of RIPB approaches. There's growing realization within the nuclear community that conventional, prescriptive, and deterministic approaches are not going to support increasing use of nuclear technology to play its rightful role for the benefit of society. Socializing alternative approaches could drive changes in industry and regulatory practices. ANS offers the community of practice files on its website to serve as a knowledge repository for the experience from a wide range of practitioners. We hope that more people will use the knowledge base to speed up needed changes in the state of the art, as well as the state of practice. These events are generally scheduled for the last Friday of a month. Today, the event we have is quite different from any we've had in the past. As Pat indicated, we have a limited number of slides, but we hope that there will be discussion after each of the slides. The lead presenter today is Rani Franovich, who will introduce herself and give you her role, I mean, what she's doing these days, and introduce the topics that we are going to talk about. I will also provide some of my background as we go through the discussion. So I'd like to invite Rani to begin this special community of practice session. Rani, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Prasad. Hello, everyone, and glad you could join us for this community of practice. It'll be a bit of a departure from past precedents, but I think it'll be an engaging conversation, and I look forward to it. Before I get started, my name again is Rani Franovich. I am the principal consultant and an expert witness, and the owner of the company Nuclear Rose Consulting. Before I established this company, I had spent 30 years with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in various roles, including a resident inspector at a nuclear power plant that's currently operating. And after that, I spent about a year, maybe a little more than a year, with a think tank headquartered out of Berkeley, advocating for nuclear regulatory modernization. And with that, I would like to go on and get started with the first slide, Pat, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so in the beginning, when I first joined the NRC in 1991, The regulatory approach was to enforce compliance with requirements. The NRC's systematic assessment of licensee performance applied this approach, which in turn translated to high operating and maintenance costs, often without a commensurate improvement in safety. In 1994, Towers Perrin, an independent management consulting firm, uncovered chronic and persistent problems with the NRC's management of the regulatory process, specifically NRC's focus on enforcement of compliance with prescriptive deterministic regulations. The firm claimed this distracted attention and diverted resources from operational safety. 4 years later, in July 1998, Joe Colvin, then president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, or NEI, testified before Congress and called for NRC to replace an outdated regulatory framework with one that is safety-focused and responsive. He also pressed for meaningful regulatory reforms. In response, Congress threatened to deeply cut NRC's budget unless it modernized its inspection and oversight regimes. NRC insiders like Prasad and me call this the near-death experience. Well, this got the Commission's attention. In 1999, the Commission directed the staff to develop a risk-informed, performance-based approach to regulatory decision-making that combines the risk-informed and, and performance-based elements defined in SRM SECI 98-144 and apply these concepts to NRC rulemaking, licensing, inspection, assessment, enforcement, and other decision-making. That was 25 years ago. Not much progress has been made with one exception. In 2000, NRC implemented a new reactor oversight process, the ROP. At the time, I was a resident inspector at the Catawba Nuclear Station. The resistance to change was palpable. The following year brought 9/11 and reversed many efficiencies gained in NRC's oversight of nuclear security. Congressional and commission direction to modernize was left incomplete, and licensing frameworks remained largely deterministic and prescriptive. And Prasad has memories of efforts to modernize even before the ROP pertaining to the maintenance rule. Prasad, do you want to share your memory from that time?
Well, yes, sure. Of course, what Rani provides is the perspective from the field, which is where she was carrying out NRC's mission. I was in headquarters at the time. In fact, throughout my career at NRC, I had licensed a nuclear power plant, the South Texas Unit 1. I had moved on to do generic communications, bulletins, generic letters, and information notices. And, I was looking firsthand at the reports on the issues related to maintenance at operating plants. And so my recollection of the history that Rani presented goes back to the staff efforts to do something about these events or observations at the operating plants. And so my history of the issues that Rani speaks about go back to the maintenance rule. And I would say that that was the first time that the NRC confronted the difficult issues associated with avoiding prescription in regulation. As Rani pointed out, you can be prescriptive or performance-based, and quite often the staff's first response to anything was to prescribe. So anyway, that was where I would start looking for the kinds of issues that Rani is talking about.
Okay, thanks, Prasad. And that's an interesting perspective from a headquarters technical reviewer working on some of these policy and technical issues. So today, most stakeholders agree that regulatory modernization is necessary to keep pace with innovation, incentivize improved safety outcomes, and mitigate enterprise risk to the industry. But what modernization looks like may differ among stakeholders, with some arguing it's all about risk informing regulatory decisions, and others arguing that this is only one aspect of the solution that does not address an objectives driven focus on outcomes, which would be the performance based approaches. So, with that, Pat, we have a few minutes for discussion.
Well, I'd like to lead off, and I invite people to raise your hands, but I also wanted to draw attention over this period that Rani spoke about to something that the Commission undertook, which actually resulted in the SRM that Rani spoke about. It was the Strategic Assessment and Rebaselining Initiative, and that's what resulted in a number of reports, including one on direction setting issue 12, which produced this SRM that Rani referred to. We have Timothy. Tim, go ahead, please.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm driving, but thanks for hosting this session. You mentioned some of the performance aspects, and I think it'd be helpful maybe to define maybe or just kind of talk about some of the differences between performance requirements, like PRA requirements according to the L&D process, and like functional requirements, and just kind of those differences between the requirements and how you put performance in. Sometimes you put it in requirements, and like that'll be how the system has to meet some value. So I don't want to provide the definitions. I want to have you all kind of talk about that. But can you kind of talk about some of the differences between performance requirements, PRA, or risk requirements, and how you derive some of those different criteria in meeting a design from this new approach to licensing?
Rani, you want to respond first?
Well, I'm not all that familiar with the PRA requirements, but I would just suggest that performance requirements are unique in that they're defined at a very high level. They're performance objectives, and the means to achieving those objectives are less prescriptive and provide flexibility in terms of how the higher level performance standards or objectives are met. Whereas my understanding of PRA requirements is that they are fairly prescriptive in terms of defining what an acceptable PRA methodology would constitute. And with that, Prasad, happy to pass it to you to comment on, or anyone else who would like to.
Well, Norbert had his hand up first. Go ahead, Norbert.
Yeah, so just a couple comments. So in the slide, it says prescriptive regulations. And let's say regulatory framework, because there's a lot of different pieces to the regulatory framework. But one of my issues is I think whether it's prescriptive or performance-based depends a little bit on your perspective. And we can talk more about that later. For instance, the general design criteria says that AOs shouldn't cause fuel damage. Is that prescriptive or performance-based? So some people would think that that's performance-based. We were established a level of performance. Whatever your anticipated operational occurrence, you shouldn't have fuel damage. So in some ways, there are pieces of the regulatory framework that are already performance-based, but it's a little bit about whether it's prescriptive or performance-based is a little bit about perspective. And there you can be at various levels of abstraction, but that's my comment on prescriptive and performance-based.
Norbert, you're quite right, and I think we'll be covering some of this, as we go along. So why don't we move to the next slide, Pat?
Oh,
Okay, and that was just a 1 minute warning, so there was still 1 more minute.
Ralph had his hand up.
Oh, Ralph, you had your hand up and then you took it down. But
I didn't take it down intentionally. Can you hear me?
oh, yeah,
Yes.
yes, I can. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can I share my screen?
I don't think so.
Can we try?
I can stop sharing if you want.
Would you please? Thank
It
you,
would
Kathy.
take longer than that minute, though. I wonder if we should do that after the presentation.
Pat, if you
we
could
have
bear
time.
with me, I think this gives a perspective that would be helpful to everyone.
It's up to the presenters, of course.
I think Prasad, I'll defer to you.
Well, Ralph, I think if you can just share what it is that you'd like to show, just so we'll be able to move on. And then if we have time, we can certainly come back to you. Well, if you're able to do it quickly, go ahead.
Thank you. So what I'm sharing, and let me make this larger for you. This is a traditional systems engineering approach with a V diagram, where on the left-hand side, as you're coming down, you're developing your design. And as you come back up, you're building the plant or the components. So on the top left, at the very high level, at the site infrastructure plant, when you're first starting the plant, you have your objectives. You have those requirements that were just spoken about by Norbert. And they can be functional requirements, what something has to do, what the plant has to do, and how well it has to do it, which is your performance requirement. The key thing, and then that gets more detailed as you go down in designing the systems. Those objectives slow down into requirements for the site or for the plant, in a sense, for the nuclear island. And then those requirements for the nuclear island flow down to the systems within the nuclear island, and they flow down to the components that make up the systems. Now, as you develop those requirements, you develop verification requirements. If a system has to meet certain performance requirements, you're going to verify that by testing it once you've established it, once you've got the system built. A component, you have established the requirements for a component. A pump has to move 500 gallons of water at certain pressure and temperature. You can do factory testing, and then you can do in-service or installation testing when you're starting the plant up to verify that that component, that pump, meets those requirements. So it's not like the performance is separate from the verification. They're tied in together.
Yeah.
So that's the point I wanted to share.
Yeah, sure. I see the point you're making, Ralph, and this is something that's very much part of an ongoing discussion we are having. But what Rani and I are trying to provide is, what are the constituent parts of what is called RIPB, and the relative roles of the risk-informed aspect and the performance-based aspect. And basically, our observation is that the PB part of RIPB doesn't get discussed enough, so that we all have a common understanding as to what that means. So let me move on to this slide where I'll try to to indicate what I'm talking about, and also hopefully respond to the point you were making, Ralph. The fact is that when the commission issued this SRM, we've spoken about, what the commission did was provide definitions of these terms in a way that just gave attributes associated with each of these terms. So The commission provided the attributes associated with a risk-informed approach, with a performance-based approach, and with the risk-informed performance-based approach, which these days we call RIPB. So, what the commission expected, I believe, is that these definitions should be used to answer the question, how can we know that a performance-based approach has been implemented and implemented in a way that is consistent with the commission's direction? So it is in order to answer that question, what we are talking about in this SRM, become important. Now, if these attributes are absent, it just means that something other than a performance-based approach was used. It does not mean that the approach is wrong from a technical sense. It does mean that applying the label performance-based may be inappropriate. For example, if you look at the specific attributes over here, that's part of, this is verbatim from the SRM, there should be measurable parameters, and then it goes on to say what those are. There should be objective criteria to assess performance, and you can establish the criteria by risk insights, deterministic analysis, or performance history. The third attribute is that the licensees must have flexibility to determine how to meet the established performance criteria. And also in providing this flexibility, the regulatory system should have a way that of encouraging and rewarding improved outcomes. So this is a key part which, on the face of it, it's just a theoretical construct. It needed to be fleshed out, and that's where additionally, let me just move on to the fourth attribute. A framework exists in which failure to meet a performance criterion, while undesirable, will not in and of itself constitute or result in immediate safety concern. So the point is that these are, in a sense, theoretical until, they have some additional guidelines associated with them. And the reason why it's important to even think about going beyond what the commission offered is because you can achieve a high level of safety performance without undue regulatory burden or intrusive NRC roles in these things. And so there was some serious research that was done. And what we did was develop practical ways to realize the benefits of the performance-based approach, to deal with the difficulties of a prescriptive approach. So let me just go on before we open it up for discussion to the next slide and say and just describe, how this was, Pat, next slide. So, the research that was done and the documents that were produced, in fact, led to what I would call are I would say a distillation of what we need to implement a performance-based approach in a formal sense and be consistent with the commission's direction. So, the fact is that using these approaches we have to make sure that the regulator is able to hold licensees accountable to meeting specific requirements. So what are the practical ways of doing this? Well, what we need are observable parameters that are directly related to an outcome. What we also need is objective acceptance criteria for each of the parameters in order to be able to set the certain limits in the operation or even in the safety assessment. A decision-making framework has to be part of what is done for evaluating and assessing physical and temporal margins, because that is where, what we look for are leading indicators of, problems before they become actual safety issues. And this is as much, during the review of an applicant and the safety case as it is an operating plant. So all this needs to be done, providing flexibility to the licensee to show that the margins are being employed to improve outcomes. So the set of ideas come together in order to be an alternative to be considered to the traditional prescriptive approach. So, again, just by way of what all we are trying to do in this area, the RP3C committee developed a guidance document that, again, tries to reflect all these attributes and help people who are writing standards. So, this is where I'd like to see what others who may be, trying to implement a performance-based approach. What are your experiences along these lines? I'm opening it up for people to respond. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, just to offer a quick perspective and kind of confirm what people shared before, Ralph, your diagram about talking about as you design and then actually start building that kind of V diagram, you really do get into more specific requirements as you get into more of a component level, and it's something that we've been experiencing at at TerraPower as we go through the safety the safety classification of each SSC. And you can look at it depending on how much information you have in your design. You can go down to the specific body of a valve and how that component has to be structurally sound to this ISO standard, and then another component of that valve might meet another standard, and these are different performance requirements. But it really gets to more specificity as you get into a more detailed design level, and I think that's why this is a really good process and approach, because it kind of grows with you. And I'm a little biased maybe because this whole risk-informed performance space has grown with my career in nuclear, so I've kind of been involved in this for a while on and off, and so it all kind of makes sense to me, but maybe that's just because I was inundated with it early on.
Thank you, Tim. And any other perspectives? Okay, let's move on. Rani, you want to take over the next slide? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. And before I get started, I'll just say, Ralph, what you presented is what I would consider to be the licensee flexibility in the design process, which would be a level beneath what I think the regulator would be verifying in a performance-based kind of approach or framework for reviewing and approving that design, if that helps. I think the context is slightly different for the regulator than it is for the designer. So if we could go to slide 5, please. Okay, I think we're there. As Prasad mentioned, regulatory modernization really kind of began at the NRC with the maintenance rule in the early 1990s. And the SRM SECI 98-144 defined the terms risk-informed and performance-based, with prescription as the antithesis of an objectives-oriented performance-based approach, and determinism as the antithesis of a risk-based approach. So these terms were applied to develop the new ROP in 2000. On March 21st, 2011, the Commission approved recommended improvements to the construction ROP, or the CROP, and the staff did not recommend construction performance indicators, or PIs, because no performance data existed at the time. So the staff planned to evaluate construction PIs during the annual CROP self-assessment. However, to my knowledge, no CROP performance indicators were subsequently developed. As such, inspection findings were the only input to the construction performance assessment process. On April 21st, 2016, the NRC's Executive Director for Operations testified before Congress. The topic was again regulatory reform, modernization, increased transparency, and accountability of NRC. The NRC's EDO assured Congress of his commitment to efficiency and readiness by 2019 to review applications for advanced non-light water reactors under a new licensing framework being developed by NRC staff. Meanwhile, the industry developed the Licensing Modernization Project, or LMP, for use under Part 50 to license advanced reactors. In 2019, Congress passed the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, which Prasad mentioned before, NEMA. And this defined what it meant by modernization, mandating that the NRC complete the work it began in the late 1990s and deliver the licensing framework promised in 2016. Specifically, NEMA directed the NRC to develop a technology-inclusive licensing framework for new and advanced reactors that applies risk-informed and performance-based principles. In response, the NRC developed proposed language for a new regulation under Part 53. The proposed rule borrowed heavily from existing regulations for large light water reactors and was deemed by the industry neither useful nor usable. Presently, the NRC is conducting workshops on an advanced reactor construction oversight process, or RCOP. The third workshop was hosted just last week. The preliminary focus is again on inspection and compliance with requirements. So Pat, with that, we have a few minutes for discussion.
Okay, thank you. You had plenty of time left over, but we'll go to discussions. If anyone would like to add something, please raise your hand.
Pat, I think you're not coming through clearly. Maybe the microphone has moved away.
You know, maybe I need a new microphone. I will try and talk louder. I apologize. We do have plenty of time for questions, and I would suggest for anyone interested to provide some feedback to raise their hand. So it seems as if we can go on to the next slide then.
All right. And Pat, we can hear you fine now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so legislation is a key component of modernization, but beyond the scope of this COP and discussion of what it means to be performance-based. So just before the NRC's Regulatory Information Conference in mid-March of this year, the Commission directed NRC staff to address stakeholder objections to the proposed 10 CFR Part 53 rule package within 6 months. Specifically, the Commission did the following. First, they disapproved inclusion of Framework B and called for a less prescriptive regulation with Framework B relocated to guidance. Second, they disapproved codification of the quantitative health objectives, or QHOs, underpinning a risk-based approach, and called for allowing applicants to propose a comprehensive plant risk metric or set of metrics, and a description of the associated methodology for meeting the metric or metrics. And third, the Commission disapproved application of consensus probabilistic risk assessment, or PRA, standards and called for a performance-based focus on outcomes rather than strict adherence to a specification or checklist. So this is an encouraging signal from NRC's top leadership. The ETA for a revised rule package is September 2024, and a lot of us are really very eager to see what the staff develops. The RCOP presents another opportunity for new direction, although the preliminary focus is on inspection and compliance with requirements. The staff does appear to be receptive to a couple of things. One is feedback that their approach needs to be more performance-based. And the other is applicant proposals for modern inspection regimes and performance indicators should also be something the NRC staff is open to. However, a lack of coherence around what is meant by performance-based poses a challenge for NRC to satisfy 1999 Commission direction, NEMA, and stakeholders seeking regulatory modernization. So, Pat, with that, we have some time for discussion again.
And once again, you finished early. So we'll open it for discussion and look for some hands or your fingers raised. Or would anyone like to share perspective, perhaps? I guess you get to keep going, Rani.
All right, then. So let's go to slide 7, impediments to modernization. Okay, impediments include long-standing resistance to change. As I mentioned, when I was an inspector in the field, there was a lot of resistance to change. That was 25 years ago. Conflation of terminology and deficient knowledge of foundational commission policy. So, as I mentioned, I think those pockets of resistance are a cultural challenge that one could argue persists today at the NRC and perhaps in the industry to some extent. From 2008 to 2014, I was chief of the ROP branch and routinely met with industry ROP working group members to collaboratively resolve policy and process issues, including disagreements between licensees and regional offices on NRC inspection findings. Now, despite some differing perspectives on certain matters, the focus was always on performance deficiencies and inspection findings, not enforcement of compliance, which was really reserved for willful violations, impeding the regulatory process, or events with actual consequences. Only in those rare cases would enforcement action be considered and possibly taken. However, at the NRC's Reg Info conference in March, I heard from numerous ROP working group members that there's been some backslide and a return to focus on compliance and enforcement. They attributed the backslide to a loss of brain trust and knowledge of longstanding ROP policy. Now, since NEMA was enacted, the terms risk-informed and performance-based are frequently mentioned together. However, the risk-informed discussion dominates any of that dialogue in a very PRA-centric manner, and one seldom hears any meaningful exchange of how an approach is performance-based. To the contrary, NRC and industry stakeholders frequently commingle terminology and contrast risk-informed against prescriptive or performance-based against deterministic. On June 16th, 2022, NRC hosted a public meeting to present Framework B under Part 53, and stakeholders raised concerns about alignment on these terms, risk-informed and performance-based, and what they mean. So the NRC staff agreed that this topic warranted further discussion. Thereafter, I attended a public meeting with the NRC staff and presented the definitions in SRM SECI 98-144, and the staff agreed. We all agreed that the 1999 definitions govern. However, despite this agreement, conflation persists during stakeholder exchanges and even advanced reactor stakeholder meetings. Additionally, the term risk-informed continues to dominate discussion. For example, the following question was posed during NRC's 2024 Reg Info conference. Question was, quote, "We use the term, we meaning the NRC, and others use the term risk-informed and performance-based quite a lot. But the question for the NRC is, are you really performance-based and risk-informed, or do you just say you are?" End quote. That was the question. And again, the NRC's response was focused primarily on risk-informed approaches to regulation, with a little bit of that conflation still going on. So with that, Pat, this is the end of the structured presentation. The rest of the time can be spent in discussion mode. So I'll turn it back to you for questions or comments.
Let me ask if there are any points of discussion. Otherwise, perhaps we can take up, a couple of points that Ralph raised in his chat. But we have Greg Hudson hand up. So, Greg, go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you, Prasad. Just something that I want to throw out to see what kind of reaction I get is that something that concerns me is that in general, in these types of discussions, we tend to forget that the purpose behind building a power plant is frankly a business purpose, and it sort of concerns me that it's in the business owner's best interest to have a well-performing plant, and a plant with represents a tolerable risk and all of that. But it would seem to me, I don't know how to integrate the two, but it just seems to me that that's an important consideration, and perhaps should even be a driver in defining the path forward and requirements and things of that nature. And so I just throw that out as an observation. I mean, it just, again, I just find it interesting that in many of these discussions, we tend to forget why these plants are really built or contemplated in the first place. And so food for thought.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, one that, as you mentioned, is rarely part of the dialogue. And I would just suggest that this is exactly why the industry got the ear of Congress in the late 90s with the NRC's focus on compliance with prescriptive and deterministic regulatory requirements without any real benefit to safety or any improved operating efficiency or any other consideration other than it was a regulatory requirement. And that increased operating and maintenance costs and made that business proposition, that value proposition, less attractive. And that's exactly why Congress threatened to slash NRC's budget unless it transformed its inspection and oversight process to allow the businesses to flourish. After the ROP was implemented, I will say that capacity factors really started to climb very high, and now they're, in the mid to high 90s, I think. That's very impressive, and the ROP may have contributed to that. But Greg, you're right. And I think that's why Congress is now saying, hey, look, the NRC's role is to enable the deployment of new and advanced reactors, as well as the continued operation of existing one. I hope that's a perspective that makes sense and resonates with you.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I would just add before going to Ralph that you know the issues also affect the standards world. You know, at ANS, we've been trying to do this, and you know, it is really quite a challenge. And I would just offer to everybody that ANS recently published. Risk-informed performance-based design approach for light water reactors in ANS 30.3 that actually implements a lot of the factors that have gone into the attributes that the commission provided in 98-144. Let's see, Ralph, you're next, and then David Desaulniers is next. So, Ralph, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Prasad. The a change in the regulatory atmosphere would help make the plants more cost effective, but also part of it is the focus is on safety systems and safety design in the design process, with not a proper integration of the consideration of availability factors or things that can cause unavailability. For example, a plant can be down because one of the trains is out or a safety system is out, so the plant may have to come down. But it also can come down because of inspection needs, long in-service inspection programs, in adding in-service monitoring and other things can help improve that availability factor for the plants. The plant system design standard that ASME is developing and I'm chairing is incorporating an integrated risk and availability evaluation together. So you can optimize for ensure that the plant is safe, but also optimize for availability. So that is, Greg had asked, well, how do we do that? And I think that's what we're trying, one of the things we're trying to accomplish with the plant system design standard by integrating risk and availability considerations in the design.
Thank you, Ralph. David Desaulniers.
Hey, Dave, you may be on mute. We can't hear you.
Yeah. David, would you check your mic?
He's unmuted.
Yeah. I guess maybe his sound system
He
isn't
may have
working.
dropped off to rejoin to see if he gets a better connection.
Or perhaps he can put his comment or question into the chat.
chat.
Maybe we'll hear from Norbert in the meantime. Norbert?
Yeah.
So I think the NRC is conscious about the cost factors, and it is interested in being efficient more. There are many members of the staff that are interested in being more efficient and effective. And they realize that regulation is a burden on the nuclear side that is not felt by the fossil side, and also with solar subsidies, it's hard to be competitive. So there is awareness of that, but the reason you don't hear the Nuclear Regulatory Commission talk about that is that's not really our concern. The concern of the NRC is a subset of the concerns of the owner, right? And so we shouldn't be talking about availability or regulating availability, right? Because that's not our concern. Our concern is safety. So that's why, predominantly, to address Greg's question, why the NRC is silent on things like capacity factors or availability. That's not in our scope. But one thing that occurs is when you transition to a performance-based, you will eventually have to implement that. And when you design a facility, you have to license a design. The staff has to have comfort that the design will meet the performance criteria established. So that may be more challenging than you suspect, right? Because if you license it based on a promise, that I don't think you can get the staff to go that far. But you're going to have to demonstrate that the design is going to meet the goals that you establish, whatever your performance goals are. You have to somehow demonstrate to the staff with enough confidence that it's your design will do that. And I think that's where the problem is really going to get to, because it's not clear how you do that. And now Dave looks like he can talk again, so I'll stop.
Yeah, let's go to Dave.
But before we go to Dave, I just wanted to kind of bring a more grounding response to Norbert's perspective, and it's a widely held perspective at the NRC staff that the interest of the regulator is in safety. And I would argue that that is a very narrow focus that was not the one intended by Congress when it established the Atomic Energy Commission in 1954 with the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. Commission, or not commission, the Congress, and this kind of grew out of the Atoms for Peace program that then President Dwight Eisenhower was promoting, established the Atomic Energy Commission to license and regulate the civilian use of nuclear materials for the benefit of society, to improve the general welfare, and to improve the NRC, or not the NRC, the nation's economic opportunities. There were some very beneficial uses of the technology that were recognized in the 1950s that prompted the Atoms for Peace program in Congress to say, we need to apply these to improve the general welfare of our people, of the nation. And so I agree that safety is the rather myopic focus of the NRC, but its mandate is broader than that. And I think that there needs to be some kind of broadening of perspective around the approach to regulation to acknowledge that. So with that thought, Dave, can you unmute yourself and let's see if we can hear you this time?
You hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
very well.
Okay, great. Yeah, just the problem with having the microphone set to the wrong equipment. But thanks. What I was trying to say is hi, Prasad and Rani. Good to hear and see you.
Likewise.
Nice presentations. I wanted to go back a little bit, if we could, to Prasad, the earlier slide that you presented when you were showing the 4 criteria for a performance-based approach or regulation that the commission had set forth, because it raised a question for me, and I think that I've struggled with.
Go ahead.
I think is going back.
That's slide, I think, the previous one to this.
Previous, yeah. Previous to this, I think, because that's the practical implementation, and I was good to see the practical implementation, because item 1 in the 2 slides differs, and where I struggled with looking at the first one, a measurable or calculable parameter that can be used to calculate the parameter exists to monitor the system, including facility and licensee performance. And as I looked at that, I've struggled with this issue. I've worked on a number of rulemakings over the years, and as I think the 2 of you are aware, I work in the human performance area, and so much of the requirements that I've looked to develop were related to human performance. But when I get to look at this performance-based description and start thinking about these parameters, it brings me back to, plant parameters. This specific reference to physical parameters of interest. Now, that seems to have been softened in the practical approach, but it did raise for me the concern or the question that was brought up by the gentleman that showed the V diagram, and starting to think about this question of, well, what level in that V diagram are we creating our specifications and being performance-based? Because it seems to me as soon as you start picking a parameter, you're challenging then item 3 in this list of giving licensees flexibility, because you're starting to narrow down the possibilities of of what you're achieving, and as a result, how you're achieving it.
Sorry, David, just in the interest of time, I wanted to respond by saying that's exactly why the practical implementation differs from these attributes, because, the guidance that was developed and documented went back to the commission, back and forth in several commission papers and SRMs, and eventually resulted in a set of guidelines, that dealt with, in practice, what does it mean to have parameters with objective criteria and provide flexibility, and all within a framework for decision making. And so, my response to you basically is that, these were the questions that were asked and answered and are documented and available to NRC staff right now. And, my regret is that they're not being used. So, anyway, we are approaching the end of the hour. I try to keep these things, within the time constraints. Ralph, if you can very quickly make your comment, please.
Yes, Prasad, thank you. So the top left of the V diagram, it concludes all those high level, like in the one you're showing, the mission statement and your customer, also your regulatory requirements are at the very top end of the pyramid you're showing. So as these flow down, the designer or the owner has the flexibility to determine how they're going to meet those and achieve those performance goals. And they do that when they start their system level and then their detailed level. And to David's point, you get your system specification comes out of the middle box on the left side of the V, and on the right side of the V, you're doing your system startup testing to verify that the system satisfies the system specifications. So it all does to come together very well.
Yeah, they do. And I fully agree with you that these issues are entirely solvable, and there's already existing guidance to provide solutions, to actually, implement the solutions. And, I would say that's what some of us are continuing to work on. And, thank you, Rani, for putting up the slide from previous. I think you're the one that put it up, right?
I did. And this is really kind of an inverted diagram of the exact same thing that Ralph had depicted in his diagram. And what it shows here is that, and this was, the context was part 53. So the very top of the pyramid here would be what the rule would specify. And then the customer requirements and system technical requirements here would be in a state of transition between what would be prescribed at a high level in the rule and what would really be left to the applicant to choose and demonstrate. And then beneath that, this is all applicant flexibility. So Ralph, I think we're in violent agreement. The question and context of this discussion is probably more about where should the regulator's focus be? And then, of course, the designer's focus would really take it to the next level deeper, and that might be a way of demonstrating it for the regulator. But in terms of
And Ronnie, in that context, that top level of the V,
Yep.
left to right, that's where I see the regular space be.
Yes, we're in violent agreement.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of common ground, Ralph, that we can continue to explore as we have been doing over the past several years. But anyway, I think we've reached the end of the hour. I want to thank everybody for participating in this, rather unique event as a community of practice. Pat, I want to thank you very much for, helping us go through this experience, and hope everybody got something out of the discussions. And
Yes, thank you, Pat and Kathy, both of you.
yeah, Kathy too. I'm sorry, didn't mention. But let's see. I guess thanks to and Pat. Shall we close up now?
I will. You all have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks a lot.
everybody.